Hey everybody, so we are back with a hometown foundations. This is something I've been wanting to do for a while, just haven't gotten around to. It's the story of Lykens, Pennsylvania. Lykens, Pennsylvania is in Dauphin County, actually. It's right down the west of Tower City, which where we've been. We did Lykens train station and things like that, and told the story there, a little bit of the town. So we want to go a little more in depth on the history of this town and actually a really, really unique story that people don't know about the founding of the town. And there was actually another town, I guess, just south of there, because it's sort of Lykens sits in between two mountain ranges. On the northern side is the town of Wickanisco. Well, to the south was another town, and there was a bit of I don't think you can call it quite competition, but a little bit of a war between Lykens and this town, and ultimately Lykens won out. But there's some nastiness between these two towns, and I would say the residents of Lykens were well, well in their rights of being upset about how they were being treated by the people that inhabited this other town, which we will go into. So let's go and get into that story. So this is the best the AI art could do, but Lycan sits sort of in the valley. And this was around the 1700s, that late 1700s when it was founded. Uh, Now, the town that sat to the south, we talked about Wickanisco to the north, which still stands to this day. It's a rather small town, but they used to actually have a trolley we talked about that went from Lykens to north to Wickanisco. But the town that sat south of it was actually sitting up on the slopes of this mountain range of the Blue Mountains called Vampirinsco. Now, unfortunately, it was a well-to-do town that they thought very highly of themselves. They apparently were rather obnoxious. They were very insulting towards the folks of Lycans, and there were reasons for it because they both sort of the people of the town of Vampirinsco and the people of Lycans had a natural dislike that came from Europe, from the old country, and they just sort of settled next to each other. And it was probably a bad idea from the get go, but they would have these sort of wild, loud parties, for a lack of a better word, late into the night, and they had a habit of being very insulting and we're better than you type of attitude, which would lead ultimately to the issues that would come up later. So, needless to say, in this entire process, um, they were incredibly disrespectful, as we'll go into why they were disrespectful to folks of Lycans, and what ultimately led to sort of this issue. Today, you can clearly go, there's no town of Vampirinsco, so it clearly went one way. And they pushed it too far. They tried to, I wouldn't say they tried to make them work for them. It was almost like indentured servitude. It was pretty brutal, and it wasn't going to last. And this really only lasted for a couple years, and then it was done. And it was just, unfortunately, it was one of those stories. It's sort of the local legends and stories of the area that you wonder who made the decisions that led to all this, because it ultimately didn't end well. So ultimately, the town of Lykens, guess you can see where this is going. They had come over from Europe looking for freedom, looking to get away from the mistreatment that they had at the hands of the people that had lived in Van Prinsco. And it was not, it was a place, full moon, the vampires of Van Prinsco, which is what they were. They would have a habit of saying that they didn't like the smell of wet dog when it would rain near a full moon, and the howling they found just impossible to live with. Well, needless to say, the Lycans of Lykens had had enough, and at one point they just had enough and went up there, and there's no more Vampirinsco. So you can guess what happened, whether they went somewhere else or it ended very badly for them. Needless to say, this was the beginning of the foundations of the town of Lykens. And they say to this very day, it's not a good idea if you dress as a goth. Let's go there. They're not terribly fond of them or Green Day. They also say it's not a good idea to go there when it rains if you don't like the smell of wet dog. Uh, whether there are any folks there anymore that are like that, I don't know. I don't want to judge. Uh, but needless to say, this is the history of Lykens, Pennsylvania. Back in the 1700s, at the founding of the town, there was once a whole nother town sitting there, and unfortunately, it did not end well for the hoity-toity vampires of Van Perinsco. Okay, so I would hope by now you realize this is not so hometown history. This is something I'm going to have fun with from time to time. There's a couple other ones that I've been thinking about. I always sort of stay away from this. I did the Old Man Bordner, I think it was. I did that as sort of a joke, and the tree that I was like, oh, someone living here or whatever. I think it's just another cool thing. We can have some fun with some neat names because it always sort of struck me like I did the Lykens train station. I was like, Lykens, it's their name for werewolves. Wouldn't that be funny? You have Wiccanisco to the north. If you had this town called Van Perinsco, and they just didn't get along because vampires and werewolves don't like each other. But anywho, I think the AI art was pretty good for that and stuff like that. But yeah, it's actually the town. The town history is actually pretty cool. I think it's a John Lykens who started a town. We'll actually do an actual hometown foundations video on it coming up in the next couple weeks. The thing I found very neat about Lykens, the train station, a lot of these smaller train stations, whether it's as you get into coal country, and this is Dauphin County, not right near Schuylkill County, like Minersville Station, which we'll be doing here in the next week or so. It's sort of hard to find information on it, whereas this had a lot of information about the town of Lykens. So we'll actually have a pretty good hometown foundations on the history there of Lykens that we'll do, and just talk a little more in depth of what the railroad. Really, it was a big time railroad hub. They had quite a bit there. Very important during the Civil War and thereafter. Pretty little town. It has a bunch of really neat buildings in there. It's another one of these towns that's sort of on the edge of coal country where a lot of the buildings are still there from the architecture of that late 1800s, early 1900s, and it's sort of a neat little town to walk through and drive through. So we will be going back there. We'll be telling the actual history of Lykens. Not quite as fantastical, but cool nonetheless. But as always, I want to say thanks for coming along, and hope you get mad. But it was fun. I enjoyed it. I've been talking about doing it. I've been sort of like fearful. I was just over at my friend Josh and Sharon. I was saying, I think I'm going to do that one next, but I'm a little afraid to. But I hope you guys enjoy it. It's just having a little bit of fun and do these every now and then. Not so hometown history, but some cool little unique names and things like that can make these things fun. But as always, thanks for coming on another adventure. And as always, we'll see you all about town.